So before we start, just quickly, my name is Nina Horowitz. I will be moderating the question and answer and all your comments. As you can see, feel free to use the chat box for discussion during the webinar, anything you want to share sort of generally. But if you have specific questions to Professor Murdoch, I would love you to use the Q&A function. You can also upvote questions. So if you see a question there that is very close to something that you'd like to ask, please upvote it, and we'll be rephrasing the questions on your behalf. With quite a big audience today, so unfortunately we can't invite you personally to ask questions, but we'll monitor both the question and answer and the chat box. And with me is Michael Zita from the University of Vienna to monitor the conversations. I wish you all a warm welcome from my behalf and an interesting and engaging webinar.
Perhaps also another thing, please send your messages to panelists and attendees, because that other participants can see it as well, that not the same questions are asked over and over again.
Well then.
Are we ready to go?
Yeah, are we ready to go?
Yeah, I'm fine.
We're ready. We have
so then Mina will start, yeah?
Yes, welcome everybody. My name is Mina Horowitz. Once again, I'm part of the so-called Utopias project from the University of Helsinki, here with my colleagues who will soon introduce themselves. Myself and Michael Zita from the University of Vienna will be monitoring both the chat and the question and answer. So when you have general things to share, please share them in the chat. Also to all panelists and attendees, as Michael said a while ago, if you have direct questions to our esteemed speaker, Professor Murdoch, please use the question and answer function. And you can also upvote questions. So if you see a question that is very similar to yours, we know that we'll ask those most wanted questions. We'll be rephrasing them on your behalf because we're kind of a sizable audience. So thank you so much for joining us. And let's have a wonderful, engaging and interesting conversation on a topic so close to our hearts and so important right now, PSM in a time of challenges.
So then, may I go on? Welcome everybody to all participants of our webinar with Graham Murdoch. In a few moments, he will address some of the most alarming challenges we are currently facing: climate change, the coronavirus, and how public service media could react in terms of connectivity and its role for society and democracy. This webinar is part of a research network on innovation in public service media, focusing on digital transformation, how public service media can keep pace and eventually challenge the overwhelming global data companies currently dominating the internet. It's about new ideas and perspectives, innovation, and a vivid debate that might affect scientists, media experts, and citizens like you. You will get some more information later on from Alessandro Darma and Christian Fuchs from Westminster University, London, and Mina Horowitz, you've seen her already, University of Helsinki. My name is Klaus Unterberger. I'm working for the Austrian Public Service Broadcasting Corporation. In doing so, I'm deeply convinced public service media must change. There's no way for business as usual, no time for memories about the good old days. This is why this project of ours is not about defending the current status of public service media. On the contrary, it reaches out to new visions, even utopias. Maybe they are provocative and radical, not realistic for today, but powerful for the future. In fact, it is about democracy and the perspective how public service media in the true sense of the word could be useful for our societies and for democracy. Graham Murdoch is one of the academic voices reaching out for new opportunities and perspectives for many, many years, addressing the idea of the digital commons, most recently in relation to the climate emergency. His work has been translated into 21 languages. He agreed to share his insight with us, and he will do so for the next 50, 40, or 55 minutes. Let's see. You are invited to post comments and to question in the chat box. After his talk, we will have some space for debate. Well, it's time to start, Graham. The stage, this time the online version, is yours.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers and to those of you who'll be respondents, and to all of you for tuning in. We're, I think, standing at a historic moment at this time, and it could go either way. We have pessimistic voices raising at this moment. One of them is Russell Davies, who's just given an interview in today's Guardian. Some of you will know Russell Davies. Russell Davies is one of Britain's most distinguished and popular television dramatists. But he's very pessimistic, and I quote, he believes that the BBC is facing oblivion. I've given up fighting for it. I'll be 60 soon. I had the best of it. Well done. Bye-bye. He's particularly exercised about the rise of the new streaming systems, Netflix and Disney and all the rest. It's ironic, actually, because the BBC was the first to propose a streaming system. Most people have forgotten now. It was called Kangaroo. That was the name of the project, but it never got off the ground. It was going to be a collaboration between the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV to stream the best of British programming. But it was cancelled before it even began. And let me read you the judgment of the chair of what was then the Competition Committee. After detailed consideration, we have decided that this joint venture would be too much of a competition in an emerging market. It has to be stopped. That's the authentic voice of neoliberal authoritarianism, which has dominated the restructuring of the media landscape for the last 30 years and has progressively squeezed public broadcasting, asking it to do more for less, constructing a very hostile political climate, and repeated voices that the whole thing should be abandoned, privatized, or pushed into a corner as a subscription channel. I want to argue against that, and I have been arguing against that for a long time. There is no question whatsoever, whatever economic position you want to take, that markets cannot provide the full range of resources we need for participatory and informed citizenship. We've learned that again during the current pandemic. Next slide, please. Here are a couple of dispatches from the pandemic. It's often forgotten. Politicians tend to focus on news. They're obsessed with news. But public broadcasting does a great deal more than that. And one of the, I think, most successful parts of the BBC has been its network of local radio stations. These have been particularly important as we've seen the decimation of local news journalism, print journalism. And they've come into their own during the pandemic. They've been playing a fantastic role in coordinating activity, giving information, and connecting people who want to give help to people who need it. Contrast that with Bauer, one of the biggest owners of a chain of commercial stations. They announced earlier this year that they were going to fold 50 of their local radio stations into a single national channel, Greatest Hits Radio. As we all know, we are starved of channels that play popular music. We desperately need a new one. Local content will now be provided on a regional basis. A clear market failure. Next slide, please. Or let's take education. BBC Lockdown Learning has been providing hours of free educational materials, both for primary and secondary school children, throughout the pandemic. Contrast that with the price gouging that has now been evident in the commercial sector. Last month, over 3,000 librarians, academics, and students signed an open letter protesting the price gouging of publishers like Routledge. Take one of their titles, Integrated Play-Based Curriculum for Young Children. You might think that was exactly the sort of book you might need if you were trying to homeschool young children for the first time. But look at the price, £480 for one ebook. The print edition is £36.99. That is price gouging of a colossal scale. Next slide, please. Or take entertainment. I think one of the best things that's been shown on British television recently is Steve McQueen's 4-part drama for the BBC, Small Axe. It's a beautiful and moving and combative account of the experience of the West Indian community in London from the 1960s to the 1980s. And it speaks directly to the Windrush scandal and the hostile environment and to the Black Lives Matter movement. Contrast that with one of Netflix's great recent successes, Bridgerton. Yes, it has a large number of Black actors featuring. It's based on an alternative history, which is based on the speculation that Queen Charlotte may have had African ancestors. So it features Black actors as aristocrats. But it's set in Regency London. It trades on internationally successful templates that we're very familiar with from the family dramas of Jane Austen and Downton Abbey. It does not illuminate the current crisis in ethnic relations in Britain in a way that Steve McQueen's 4 dramas do. Perhaps Netflix might have put up the money for Steve McQueen, but I doubt it. I think that's one of the great things about public broadcasting. It takes a risk. It pushes the boundary. It doesn't always conform to the most obvious templates, the most successful formulas. So those are 3 items from a very recent experience of mine being in lockdown. But I'd like to go back a little bit and just sketch in for you why I believe so passionately that public service media have to be saved. Next slide, please. The BBC was a constant soundtrack during my childhood and my teenage years. And it was often exasperating. It was patronizing. It was paternalistic. It was snooty. It did not speak the kind of language of my neighborhood. But it did open doors. It made accessible an incredible store of erudition and knowledge. But it was also the site of a combat, because at that time, there was a seismic change going on in the society. Britain was transitioning to a post-colonial society, something it's still in the process of doing. It was losing its old industrial base. The class structure was reforming. The women's movement was rising. There were youth movements. The BBC, at its best, responded to that. And so there were also dissonant, combative voices in amongst the kind of paternalistic discourse. And the fact that way too often the corporation flew too close to the government agenda. But that competition was always there and it always opened doors. But for me, it was a part of a bigger whole. I would go to the local library to follow up ideas and provocations that I'd got from listening to the radio or looking at a TV show. Something I shared with Peanuts, Schultz's great character. This is a magnificent expression. I've been given my citizenship in the land of knowledge. Yes, that's exactly what public cultural media do. They give us citizenship in the land of knowledge. And I was lucky, I grew up in London, so I had access to a great range of world-class free museums and galleries. And that great arc of public provision was fundamental in my intellectual and emotional formation. Without it, there's no question I would not be where I am today. I certainly would not be a professor in a university. It gave me the resources that allowed me to develop. But it also was part of a wider configuration of civic culture. I lived in a neighborhood which was thick with amateur astronomers, amateur naturalists, musicians, people who sung in choirs, people who argued and campaigned on local issues, an enormous range of grassroots participation and activity that was also fundamental for me in forming my political and intellectual universe. Next slide, please. And as I progressed in my studies, I began to think about this. And I began to think about the cultural economy that we live in as being roughly divided into three columns. And here they are. You've got the commodity economy, overwhelmingly oriented to consumption and commercialism. You've got the economy of public goods, the museums, the libraries, and public broadcasting. But you've also got what I came to see as gift economies, economies where people give up their time and their expertise to collaborate together to make something that everybody could share. So for me, the question became, was it possible to put together those last two columns? Was it possible to combine public goods and gifts into a formation that would present a strong counterbalance to the commodification of the commercial system? Next slide, please. And there were interesting indications, something that again has been almost forgotten now, the Doomsday Project that the BBC ran between 1984 and 1986. It was to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the Doomsday Book. It's paradoxical, of course, because the Doomsday Book was the first example of mass surveillance of the civilian population. In fact, people complained at the time that the people who came to measure up how many cows and pigs they had took things way too far. But it was a total mapping of the country. And the Doomsday Project was an attempt to replicate that. But it did something very interesting. It had two discs. One disc was an expert disc from authoritative people. The other was produced by photographs, oral testimonies, pieces of film donated by the general population. And in amongst that, you found some very competitive things. Chronicles of the miners' strike, for example, or the closure of pits. So you saw there an attempt to put that grassroots activity alongside and together with expert resources. Unfortunately, they chose to put this on the Philips Laserdisc, which very rapidly lost out in the format wars. And for a point in time, it was very difficult to find any machines that would play these discs. I'm glad to tell you that they've now been, or part of it's now been repositioned in Doomsday Reloaded, and you can find some of it on the web if you're interested, and I strongly recommend you to do that. Next slide, please. So we arrive at 2004. 2004, I'm asked to give the Spry Memorial Lecture in Canada. Graham Spry was the man who was leading the fight to persuade the Canadian government to invest in public broadcasting rather than simply be taken over by the big networks south of the border. And he won. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation emerged. Again, this was a moment in time where I could see an opportunity. This was before the great rise of the commercialized barons of the internet. Facebook was not open to the public until 2006. That's the same year that Google takes over YouTube. So when I was speaking in 2004, there was a sense of optimism about the internet. It was still primarily seen in semi-utopian terms as a space of collaboration and cooperation and free software and free knowledge. Wikipedia had begun a couple of years before and was evidently going to be incredibly successful and important. So against the pessimism that many people were voicing at the time, I argued that this gave public service broadcasters a huge opportunity, that they needed to seize the opportunities presented by the internet to create a wider, more expansive, more dynamic public repository of knowledge, experience, and argument. And interesting, that idea, I don't claim any credit for this, was taken up almost immediately in the BBC by Tony Agar. He called it the digital public space. I called it the digital commons because I wanted to use that metaphor of commercial enclosure, the way that throughout history, commercial forces have seized public property and have turned it into a private domain. But digital public space. And you'll see that Tony's vision was very, very similar to the one that I outlined. Had three basic aims. First of all, to coordinate the digital resources that were coming online and being produced by all of the great public institutions, the museums, the libraries, the universities, and the public broadcasters. Secondly, to make that resource freely available to anybody who wanted to use it. That, of course, created huge problems of copyright, which were one of the things that sunk the project. But it also was an ambition for making something accessible. One of the proposals I put forward at the time was for a public search engine. There's no point in having a vast and splendid repository of resources that people cannot navigate their way around it. So we needed a public search engine. I also argued that one of the advantages that public broadcasting had as a node in this network was that it made programs. Unlike universities or museums or other candidates that could have been a node in this network, because programs could provide, they could kickstart, as they did for me throughout my childhood and teenage years, they could kickstart an interest in things. They could provide a gateway so that programs would no longer just be an event that you watched, they would be a portal, and you would follow them through into material that spoke to those experiences, spoke to those ideas from a variety of perspectives. But the last ambition that Tony Agar had was also very important, and that was that it should be inclusive. It wasn't simply a way of making expert knowledge more available, although that was important. It was also a space of collaboration, a space of interchange, and a space of argument. Next slide, please. Well, I still believe, and I would want to argue strongly, and we can get into this in questions, that those ambitions are exactly the starting point for the revolution we need in public service media. Those are the ambitions that have to be fulfilled. And one of the reasons I would argue that is not simply because I've argued that for a long time, but because I think what's happening now has made that more urgent than ever. But it's also added new challenges to the agenda. The most obvious challenge, and the one that has received the most attention, is that we are now in a situation of hyper-consumerism that is driving a catastrophic climate crisis and environmental degradation. I'll come back to this in a minute. That argues very strongly for having a strong space in public culture that is not financed and saturated with advertising. I would say it's a civic right not to have to watch things interrupted by advertising. But we also see the destruction of deliberative democracy. Those appalling shots of people storming the Capitol building in Washington, the seat of the world's first republic, and the role of the media in exacerbating that. So let me just talk you briefly through some of these problems. Next slide. Let's begin with climate change. Here's a very simple graph that demonstrates very clearly what has happened. CO2 emissions of carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas, have rocketed since 1980. That's the red zone you see there on the chart. Very, very dramatic. So we might ask ourselves, why? What is it about the period around 1980 that has been responsible for that? Next slide, please. Well, it's a complex set of processes, but I would like to pull out two. First of all, marketization. This is the moment of neoliberal ascendancy. This is the moment when across the world you see a return to competition, a return to markets, and a celebration of consumption as the primary driver of economic growth. You see that, of course, in the capitalist world, in the Northern Hemisphere, but you also see it in China. You see China is now a consumer society of dedicated consumers. You see it in the Soviet Union collapses, Russia becomes part of the global system. India gives up on self-sufficiency and enters the new American organized competitive global system. So that we see a huge increase in commercialization, including in the media. You see in country after country, those old monopoly public broadcasters are suddenly challenged by new entrants, by cable, by satellite. Suddenly people have, for the first time, access to huge amounts of advertising, persuading them to buy things. But it also coincides with the fundamental technological revolution of digitalization. And what we see from that point on is a proliferation of digital devices. We see more and more devices being manufactured and distributed. And we see the business model of the internet coalescing more and more around product promotion. Next slide, please. So let me chase true threads from that general overview. First of all, the question of materiality. This is something that I've become increasingly aware of and increasingly concerned by. When we think of the media, we think primarily of it as a set of institutions, a space of work and practices of production, a symbolic space, and a fundamental intervention in everyday life. All of those things are important and all of those things have been studied. But there's a backstory, and that backstory is the materiality of the media. The media systems depend, first of all, on infrastructures, wires, cables, masts, satellites, server farms, and arrays of devices, smartphones, tablets, laptops. And all of those infrastructures and devices are made of materials, minerals, and other materials. They consume huge amounts of energy in their production and use, and increasingly they generate vast mountains of electronic waste. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about the media, we need to think about what's come to be called carbon footprints. That is the contribution. Let's take cell phone, for example. The contribution a cell phone makes to environmental and climate crisis is not only through our use of it, but also through all of the stages of excavation and manufacture that have gone into bringing it to us. So if you wanted to calculate the carbon cost of a cell phone, you'd have to add in all those invisible processes and their contribution to creating carbon emissions. There's some interesting proposals now on the table that objects should carry a log of their carbon emissions, in the same way that we're beginning to think that food should have nutritional warnings. I would very much support that, because I think people simply do not understand what the real environmental cost of these machines is. Next slide, please. And it's going to get worse because we're manufacturing more machines, personal advisors like Siri, smart watches that can read your blood pressure, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. We're going down helter-skelter into a situation where we're going to have more and more communicating machines. And one prediction, which I think is relatively plausible, is that over the next decade, the contribution that information and communication technologies make to carbon emissions will jump from 4% to 14%. That's quite a substantial chunk. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons for that is the Internet of Things. We think of the Internet as the space where we communicate with each other. And indeed we do. We're doing it now. But from quite a way back, there were more machines talking to each other on the Internet than people. And by the time we get to 2020, you'll see that there are 50 billion devices, and they are all, or many of them, smart devices. So we're at the beginning of an avalanche of new kinds of communication machines, all of which have real consequences for the environment. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about that, we need to think about all the different steps in the production chain. We need to think about mining and extraction. We need to think about the organization of manufacture and the conditions of labor. We need to think about transport and distribution. We need to think about energy. We need to think about data storage. And we need to think about accelerated obsolescence and the way in which we're encouraged to throw these machines away after a year or 18 months. We're now at the 11th iteration of the iPhone. What's happened to all those old iPhones, all those dead iPhones? Well, they're piled up somewhere in the great electronic pyramids of our time, which are full of toxic materials. Next slide, please. So, my first recommendation is that public service media, precisely because they are central to the functioning of citizenship, have a responsibility, but also an opportunity to take the lead in promoting environmental and social sustainability as a core value governing all of their practices. This is not just about energy. It's not just about going for clean energy. It's about every aspect of the organization. It's about the food in the canteen. It's about the concrete and the steel that goes into the buildings that house the journalists. It's about the way we make the machines. And one of the great struggles of the future, and it's, if we don't win it, we may not have a future, is to struggle for non-toxic materials, for clean energy, for materials and processes that are environmentally positive rather than environmentally negative. So that's the first new challenge we face. How do we embed sustainability in our public institutions? Next slide, please. The second is to say that we need those institutions more than ever, because we're now in a situation where public culture is more saturated than it's ever been before with promotional material. But just think about it for a minute. What other interest group, and corporations are an interest group, what other interest group is given 13 minutes or sometimes even more every hour to promote its ideology? Imagine what would happen if trade unions were given 13 minutes as of right to put their messages in the middle of programs, or churches, or any other interest group. No, people would be absolutely apoplectic. But somehow we accept advertising as a necessity because it supposedly gives us free access to the programs. Of course it doesn't. We pay for them in another way, but we can come back to that. But the problem that we have, and it's a problem that's been exacerbated by digital media, is that we have more product promotion than ever before. That encourages people to think of themselves primarily as consumers, to think of their satisfaction in life primarily through the window of consumption, and to measure the success of nations in terms of how much consumption they can generate. All of that is antithetical, I would argue, to a true principle of citizenship, which is about being a member of a moral and a social community where you have obligations to other people, not just those immediate people around you, but because of climate change, obligations to future generations, obligations that you should not run away from. Let's pursue this a little bit more. Next slide, please. Look at what's happened on the internet. What you see on the internet are whole new, virtually unregulated forms of promotion. One of them is influencers. Here's the front page of a recent magazine, Teen Boss. How to build your brand by being you. You don't have to have any expertise. You don't have to have any knowledge. You just have to be yourself and rub some lipstick on or hair oil or play a computer game, which you probably would have done anyway, and you get enormous rewards. Here's Ryan. He's now 8 years old. He is this year's highest earning influencer on YouTube. And what does Ryan do? Ryan opens boxes of toys, donated to him, of course, by toy manufacturers. This is virtually unregulated. And yet imagine you grow up as a child surrounded by this. Next slide. You're also going to play games, and some games that are very well designed are advertising games. The games saturated with the logos and symbols of key corporations, particularly in the case of children, food corporations. This is KFC. But there are hundreds more. Advert games are all over the internet, and they're very, very popular with kids because they're free. Next slide, please. And you see the aggressive promotion of food that we know to be nutritionally damaging. Big, beefy bliss. There's a cost to that. Next slide, please. In fact, there are two costs. One is a personal cost. We have a chronic crisis of obesity among children, something that is escalating every day. But there's a huge social cost. Next slide, please. In order for fast and processed food to be sustained in the volumes that it is, it requires massive deforestation. One calculation is that we lose a football pitch size of primary rainforest every 6 seconds. This is a colossal social damage. Rainforests are a carbon sink. They absorb carbon dioxide, so they're extremely good for the environment. But they are also fundamental to the causation of pandemics. Next slide, please. We take the Amazon basin, most of the clearances have been for cattle ranching and for growing palm oil and soya. What happens when you clear rainforest is that you drive the species that were living there right to the edge. You either extinguish them or you drive them to the edge. And when they reach that edge, they're more likely to come into contact with humans. Next slide, please. So I'm talking to you now in lockdown. I've been locked down for almost 1 year in the UK. I'm not even allowed to have anybody come in my garden because we have the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a coronavirus. It's one of a whole series of coronaviruses, MERS, SARS, and others. It's pretty well established now that it was spread by bats. So there's a chain of transmission from the edge of those cleared forests to bats, to domestic and farm animals, and then onwards into humans. If we continue clearing those forests at the rate that we are, we will be faced with successive pandemics. They will be unstoppable, and possibly in the future they'll be untreatable. So when you see those glossy advertisements and those advert games for KFC, trace the chain backwards to those depleted forests and think, is that a social cost that we really need to bear? So we need to do two things. We obviously need to control advertising on the internet and indeed elsewhere much more stringently than we do at the moment, and measure the social costs of different products. But we also need, more desperately than ever, a fundamentally strong public cultural system that does not feature advertising. That's one of the key, I would say, arguments in our favor. Finally, there's another argument. Next slide, please. Klaus mentioned democracy. Democracies, as we understand them, as we've defined them in the West, they depend on two things. They depend on access to the voice, the ability to participate and express yourself, and the vote, the ability to elect representatives who will speak for you in assemblies. So there are two essential dimensions: deliberation and representation. Next slide, please. If we look at deliberation, what we see is the disappearance of a working public sphere. We see that not only because Facebook and Twitter and other major social media have shown themselves to be patently unable to control hate speech, incitement to violence, and racism, but also because we have a commercialized media system, that consequence of marketization, that creates a circular system. Two most important things that happened in the US were, first of all, the decision to allow internet sites to classify themselves as carriers rather than publishers, and therefore to release themselves from editorial responsibility, but also something that's often forgotten, the cancellation of the fairness doctrine, which previously mandated that television should show both sides of the argument. That's no longer true. So we have partisan television. And we can see how that works when we look at the kind of conspiracy theories that have been manufactured during the virus. Next slide, please. Let's take the lab conspiracy. It's not a single conspiracy, there are various versions of it. The mildest one is that the virus escaped from the lab in Wuhan, either by accident or because somebody deliberately took it outside. The more extreme versions are that the Chinese have manufactured it as a new biological weapon. And even more extreme is that Obama was involved in funding this. Now, you may say, look, this is crazy. Nobody's going to believe that. Well, last April, Pew did a survey of American population, and 29%, almost a third of the American population, did indeed believe this. So how is this possible? It's possible because, and this is the logic of the new commercial media, ideas and arguments that used to be on the margin, that used to be out there on the edge, are now brought into the center. Let me show you. Next slide, please. Let's take the lab conspiracy. Let's take the milder version, the idea that the virus was manufactured in the laboratory. January last year, the Washington Times, which is owned by the Moonies, an extreme religious sect, publish a story. Coronavirus may have originated in lab linked to China's biowarfare. Now, the Moonies are an extreme sect, pretty much on the edge. But by the first week of April, that conspiracy theory was attracting 5 million impressions on Twitter. And that same month, the Epoch Times, which is published by Falun Gong, implacable opponents of the current Chinese regime, publish a video tracking down the origins of the Wuhan coronavirus. But again, Falun Gong is not exactly mainstream. What happens next is what we need to pay attention to, that those ideas come into the mainstream. Next slide, please. They come on to Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch. Next slide. And they come in to one of Murdoch's major Australian newspapers, the Daily Telegraph, in a front page splash, China's batty science. And they're endorsed, first of all, by President Trump, and secondly, by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Next slide, please. So there you see something that was on the margin becoming quite central within the partisan commercialized news system. And you see the role, central role, played by Rupert Murdoch, both in his press and on Fox News. And you also see it percolating into the UK. We have a very partisan press in the UK, heavily weighted towards the right. We're about to have a Murdoch-owned news channel, yes? But we already have the Daily Telegraph, owned by the eccentric Barclay brothers, the paper that our Prime Minister used to write for, dyed-in-the-wool conservative. They published an article, or on their podcast, a comment by Sir Richard Dearlove, the ex-head of MI6, who said that he'd seen scientific evidence that the virus was manufactured in the lab. This was a paper that had not been peer-reviewed. When it was peer-reviewed, and a number of scientists looked at it carefully and found enormous fault with it, the authors were persuaded or compelled to change it. And eventually, when it's published, they describe the virus as a chimera. A chimera in biology is something that's a mixture of material from two different sources. The most logical way that happens is through natural processes. It's extremely unlikely that it would happen by human intervention. And that has indeed been conclusion of all of the people that looked at it. So here we have something that's totally inaccurate, has no firm evidential base. None of the sources that were cited have ever been made public. And yet it gains enormous traction. Next slide, please. So that is a fundamental challenge. I would argue that public broadcasting is the best placed institution to try to reconstruct the public sphere. And here's a quote from a Guardian. I do read other things beside the Guardian. It just happens that this is Timothy Garton Ash. I think he puts it very well. To prosper, democracy needs a public sphere in which citizens and their representatives engage in vigorous debate on the basis of shared facts. Restoring that kind of public sphere is now a central task. A public service broadcaster gives us not just verified facts, but a curated diversity of arguments. Notice that word curated. That's exactly what you don't have on Facebook or Twitter. Any democracy that has a decent public service broadcaster should double its budget, strengthen its independence from government, and tasking it with enhancing the digital public square. Case closed. Getting there, however, is going to be an enormous struggle. It will require, obviously, more regulation of the commercial internet, but I think it will also require us to rethink what we do in public service broadcasting. Next slide, please. Two things. Let me make two suggestions. They may seem wild. First of all, why not have a regular slot on the climate crisis in news bulletins? Why not have that as something that is always there, that raises public awareness, not just of the dimensions of the crisis, but some of the very positive interventions that are now being made that are possible, so that people can understand that this is something that is here and now and something that needs urgent action. But we also need to reconstitute debate. One of the most interesting experiments that's going on at the moment is in deliberative democracy. And one of the examples of that is the Climate Assembly. The Climate Assembly brought together 100 people, randomly chosen from all walks of life. What happens in a deliberative forum is that people are introduced to authoritative evidence and arguments, and then they're asked to make recommendations about how we should proceed. The report on that came out last year in September, and it's remarkably cool and remarkably rational. That if you give people the chance, they will come up with very sensible ideas and very level-headed opinions. But you need to take the time. The point about this is that it was over a number of weekends. So how could public broadcasting use that model of deliberative democracy? Well, next slide, please. One of the very interesting experiments, and I was involved in evaluating this, was GM Nation. It took place in the summer of 2003. It was a month-long national debate on whether Britain should accept genetically modified crops. It was very, very contentious. People were invading crop fields dressed as the Grim Reaper and in anti-contamination suits, and there were clashes with the police. And the government decided to institute a national debate. It wasn't entirely successful. But what was very interesting about it is that it combined two things. It combined local deliberations on the ground. People came to church halls and all sorts of small venues to engage in these deliberative processes. But it also had a website that hosted both information and discussion. The website wasn't very well done, but I think it points to what might be possible, that it would be possible to have public service broadcasting as the hub of a network of deliberation. That would not only be on the web and on the screen, but would also be in the local area. And that's one of the reasons why, to come back to what I was saying at the beginning, why you need a strong local presence. You need people in the community, which is why local radio is so important to retain. So maybe we could think about deliberation as a fundamental ambition for public service broadcasting. Next slide, please. But just to finish off, we need to, I've been advocating putting together broadcasting and the internet, that the digital commons is a combination. But there's a problem. We should not forget programs are still fundamentally central to people's experience of television. Next slide, please. And that's because we have a persistent digital divide. And certainly in Britain, COVID has demonstrated that these inequalities are endemic and they're going to be very, very difficult to shift. They're on different dimensions, but the two that are very evident are class and age. So if you look at the blue columns there, you see the proportion of people who'd never used the internet. 48%, almost half of the most elderly, as opposed to 1% of the youngest. Now, a lot of the discussion about how to move television forward is about the necessity to serve young people. Are we going to abandon all of those elderly people? Those are the, ironically, not ironically, but those are the people who perhaps need it most. They're the people who are isolated. They're the people who are lonely. They're the people who have chronic health conditions. So if broadcasting is not for them, something is very, very wrong. And then if we look at class, you see 23, almost a quarter of people in the lowest non-manual, lowest unskilled manual and claimant classes are not connected to the internet. Now, this presents a struggle because I would argue that we need to connect as many people as possible, but that's not going to happen soon. And it's in that space that we need to remember that programs are important for people. They're their only touch on what public service media do. Next slide, please. And if you look at the generational divide here, you look at it's for some, in some ways it's not as bad as not as bad as you think, but you see that 16 to 24-year-olds, only 1% don't use the internet, but over 65s it's 45%, 48%. That's a huge gap. And there's a kind of, in the discussion, I've done a lot of work over my career with young people, and there's a kind of condescension that oh yes, we have to have Netflix, that's all they want. No. What about all of those pupils who've joined Greta Thunberg in protesting climate change? What about all the school pupils who came to the centre of my city, Leicester, the most multicultural city outside London, and took the knee to protest against police brutality? These are not only wanting Netflix, they are wanting something more. They are wanting a service that engages with the key issues they know will shape their future. They want to know. And public broadcasting has to grasp that nettle. And it has to be militant about it, to say that it's not enough to have beautiful costume dramas. We have to hold on to the idea that knowledge, what was given to me by what Peanuts and myself were given by the library. That great public space of knowledge. We have to provide that. We have to provide it in accessible ways, and we have to provide it in engaging ways. But we do not give up on it, because if we do, we will have been responsible for destroying, I think, public culture in its current form. What will replace it is something I would not want to be part of. Thank you. This is by nature of a summary. This is taken from a really excellent book that I would recommend by radical feminist economist called Kate Raworth. It's called Donut Economics. She imagines our future as a donut. That yellow circle is the space of livable space. In order for that to be sustained, we have to address all of the familiar problems of equality and justice and access, which are on that inner circle. But we also have to ensure that we don't overshoot the planetary boundaries, which will destroy quality of life. So to put it in its grandest terms, we need to understand the contribution that public service media might make to sustaining that yellow circle, both environmentally and socially. That sustainability, the way we understand it and the way we implement it, has now to be central. Thank you.
Klaus, you need to unmute.
Sorry, I have to de-mute. If you can hear me, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Graham, for this very comprehensive insight into the transformation of society and media and the impact of all the changes on the environment and also on democracy. This will definitely stimulate and inspire our debate. And we've got now two respondents. And I would like to give the floor to the first one, to Alessandro Darma from Westminster University, London.
Thank you, Klaus. Let me echo your words. Thank you very much, Professor Murdoch, for characteristically inspiring, engaging, and eloquent talk, which I really enjoyed, as I'm sure everyone does. So as someone who does work on public service media, as public service media researcher, I guess that for me, one of the biggest takeaways from your talk is that we should never lose sight of the big picture. I think there is a tendency for people working in the field, which to an extent is understandable, to focus on important, yes, but rather specific and strategic, either strategic, technical, or policy issue. This is important, but I think Professor Murdoch's talk is, I think, a strong reminder to all of us that the debate on public service media at its core is a debate about some of the biggest issues and problems of our world today. So from the environmental crisis to the crisis of the rationality project and so on. And to me, this is also a strong endorsement of the work that we do, and an encouragement to continue to work and explore issues and challenges in public service media. So I will keep my response short. It's great to see such a big turnout this afternoon, and I see there are lots of comments already and questions in the chat. And many people would like to participate in the discussion. So I would like just to say a few words about the HRC-funded research network, which today's webinar is part of. The network, as Klaus was saying at the beginning, is called Innovation in Public Service Media Policies. So I've been running it with Minna Orwitz from the University of Helsinki since September 2019. So what motivated us to do this was we felt that the network could contribute to develop a research agenda on public service media by bringing together academics and various PSM stakeholders. And we felt in general this could be a platform to promote innovative thinking on the key challenges facing public service media around the world. And Professor Murdoch's talk today is part of one of the activities that we have run as part of the whole project. This activity is called Envisioning Public Service Media Utopias. And this was initially meant to be a 2-day face-to-face event that we had planned to hold at the University of Westminster in central London in May 2020. But because of the COVID and the first lockdown last spring, we had to cancel it. And then we decided to turn into a more experimental online discussion forum. And we invited several experts and people to debate issues around public service media, which is still ongoing. And I would like to say a big thank you to Klaus Unterberg from ORF, the Austrian public service broadcaster, and to my colleague, Professor Christian Fuchs, because they were the ones who came up with the idea of a workshop on public service media utopias. And then they also took the lead in running the project. So Klaus and Christian are in the steering group of the research network, and Mina and I couldn't have opted for 2 more committed members than them. So we're very grateful. It's been also a big commitment time-wise. So just briefly, perhaps a question to kick off the discussion, then Christian will follow up. One of the thematic clusters in our online discussion forums was about the big challenges that public service media are facing. And in his talk, Professor Murdoch has outlined some of the big societal issues that public service media can contribute to, can be a response to. And my question to you is what you see as the biggest obstacle to realizing that vision of a public digital space or a digital commons. I mean, at one point you described this as a huge, I think, a huge struggle. But if you could elaborate on this and perhaps tell us what you see as the single biggest obstacle. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know, maybe we can give Graham opportunity to react on this last question before we go to Christian Fuchs. Would that be feasible for Graham?
Well, I'd turn it around and say, what is the biggest opportunity?
Okay.
We can argue about this, but I have a sense now that the internet titans have hit a wall. They're now under increasing pressure, increasing criticism for their domination. And I think we will see more and more regulation. And I think we'll see I think the storming of the Capitol building, okay, Trump wasn't impeached, but I think you could not fail to be terrified by what happened. I mean, that was unprecedented. And there's no question that the social media were complicit in what happened. And I think we're at a tipping point now. I think that they have been given a free ride, yes, ever since they emerged. They've had virtually no opposition at all. They've been allowed to do whatever they like. I think that's coming to an end. And I think there'll be a space now. And that space has to be filled with something proactive, which is why I think that public service media have an opportunity. Yes, they're faced with hostile governments, they're faced with squeezed economies. But I think the tectonic plates are shifting now. I think that we're now in a situation where those internet giants will not be able to continue as they have. What kind of restrictions are imposed is, of course, up for grabs. But I think we have an opportunity. I think we have a space. And as I say, I went down the day that we had primary school children and secondary school children in the center of my city taking the knee, and I talked to them. They are wanting something more. They know these things. And I think public broadcasting needs to touch that and to use it. It's a moment of opportunity for me, I think, not a moment of closure. I'm the opposite of Russell Davies. I actually think we have an opportunity. I'm a congenital optimist, yes. But you have to be, yes. Otherwise, where are you going to go? You're going to sit in the cellar and, drink yourself to oblivion. Come on. Let's think about what might be possible.
Thank you very much. That's good to hear. And I'm taking one opportunity to address Christian Fuchs. He's one of the key experts of the project, and he might respond.
Thank you. Thank you for a very inspiring talk, Graham, that I enjoyed very much, and it was an inspiration for further thoughts. Alessandro mentioned already that the talk is part of his AHRC network project, Innovations in Public Service Media Policies, that he runs together with Minna Horowitz. And there we have this focus that Klaus and me suggested on envisioning public service media utopias, and the outcome of it should be a manifesto that we want to co-write together with others on the future of public service media and the public service internet. And we've done collaborative online work for that, and work on the manifesto will start very soon. And as a preparation, we are doing this online consultation on the future of public service media that has, in my opinion, thus far shown that digitalization is one of the largest challenges that public service media are facing today, as you also pointed out, Graham, in your talk. And last year, as a preparation for this work, I did an exploratory survey on the future of public service media and the internet, that where it also became evident that a key question is how alternatives to the capitalist digital giants, YouTube, Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, and so on, could and should look like. Yeah? And of course, in the realm of traditional media, as you are pointing out in your model of the three moral economies of the media, we have two alternatives to capital as the organizational form. I mean, what you call the government-led public service organization model and the civil society organization model. Yeah? These are not-for-profit alternatives. Yeah. So there's public service media that is strong at creating a large public. And then there are community media, citizens media that often take on the form of self-managed companies, so-called cooperatives that are run by workers, audiences, and users, as in the case of the radical press, open channels, free radio stations, and so on. Where, as we learned from Brecht and Enzensberger and other media theorists, what is really key is that in these civil society projects, audience participation is key. Audience members become media producers. Yeah? So the aspects of the locality participated, you pointed out, Graham, is quite foreground. Community media and citizens media. Now the question, how does that look like in the realm of digital media alternatives to the digital giants? I mean, we have similarly two concepts. We have the concept or the ideas, basically, yeah, because there are not so many alternatives in place to the digital giants. But there's the idea of a public service internet that where we have public service internet platforms run by public service media organizations. So ideas like a public search engine, public service YouTube, and so on. That's one idea. And on the other hand, we have the idea of the civil society digital media. Yeah? For example, so-called platform cooperatives, where users and platform workers are the platform's owners. And we have examples there already. For example, Fairbnb is a platform cooperative alternative to Airbnb, or Resonate is a music streaming platform co-op that is an alternative to Spotify, or Taxi App is a cooperatively run alternative to Uber. In a wider sense, maybe we can say that Wikipedia is in a way also a platform cooperative. Yeah? These alternatives, I mean, with the exception from Wikipedia, that is very successful, but these platform cooperatives run by civil society, they are all fair, democratic, and just, but they are also small, precarious, unimportant, and cannot really challenge the big capitalist platforms. So I think there's a conundrum somehow. Yeah? Public service media are very good at creating large publics, yeah, but they are not so good at organizing participation. Civil society media are much better at that, yeah, at organizing participation. They're also called participatory media. They facilitate participation, but they lack resources, yeah, and they are very bad at reaching a large public. So I'm wondering, and that's also my question, how do we overcome this conundrum that there are advantages and disadvantages of both public service media and civil society media in respect to the internet, in the realm of digital media? And when it comes to the future of the internet, Graham, what do you see as the most viable alternatives, and how should they be organized and advanced? Yeah, what do you think is the most feasible alternative to capitalist internet platforms, and what should be the role of public service media in this context? Yeah, and then politically, what needs to happen next? Yeah, so what is to be done? Yeah, what needs to happen so that alternatives can be built that are strong and powerful and can challenge, compete with, and eventually also replace the digital giants such as Google, Facebook, YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, and so on.
Well, Graham, it would be yours.
Well, I just very briefly, I think we need both of the initiatives that you outlined. The problem, I think, is coordination. The problem is finding a way to allow people to find what they need when they need it. And I think that's going to be very difficult. But that's one of the reasons why I'm still gravitating towards having some sort of centralized node. Not that that would do everything, but that would be a gateway, a switching point, if you like, into a whole range of other things. You're absolutely right that those civic grounded activities are absolutely vital, because that's what animates people. That's what gives them a sense of belonging. But there's a problem, and they need to be visible to people who may not otherwise come across them. Yes, and so we need to have some sort of centralized switching mechanism that allows people to find them, and that, I think, can only be done by public service media. I mean, there's been a long-running debate. I mean, I've been engaged with lots of people over this. A lot of people see the idea of the commons as being disaggregated, local, non-hierarchical. Yes, that's true, but it's only possible if you have some kind of centralized system. Marx would not have been able to organize the workers of Britain had he not had a free ticket to the library at the British Museum, right? That's a very good example. Yes, I mean, he was able to access knowledge that he couldn't possibly ever buy for himself, and he used that in a particular way. But somebody had to set up that library. Somebody had to say, okay, this is where we're going to store all of this stuff. It's up to you how you use it. It's up to you what you want to read, but here it is. And so there's a question of scale. I don't know what the answer to that is, and I don't think we do yet. But I think we have to, what I do think is we can't separate it and go over entirely on one side or the other. We have to think about trying to put them together. And that was the point of my kind of rethinking of these moral economies. How do we put them together productively, not so that one dominates the other, but to make everything accessible to people when they want it? That's essential. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think that's what we need to bend our minds to. And to have a clear vision for a repository of material that is comprehensive, non-exclusive, and is available to everybody free at the point of use. That for me is the starting point. Some of that material will be produced by broadcasters, but a lot of it won't. A lot of it will be produced elsewhere, but will be made accessible. That's where I think we are. So yes, platform cooperatives are a good thing, but I don't think they're the solution in themselves.
Yeah, so it's what you're basically arguing for is the dialectic of your two non-capitalist columns of the table of the moral economies, dialectic of public service media and civil society media, like Wikipedia and the BBC joining together in one organization.
Well, however, men have spoken long enough. Maybe it's time to address Minna. She has definitely maybe some answers, maybe some questions. Minna.
No answers, but 16 questions already in the Q&A.
Okay.
And I want to thank all the participants for the wonderful conversation we've been having, as well as all the resources that you have shared. This really has felt like a community. If I may try to summarize the kind of questions and comments that have been percolating throughout this session. One is, of course, what is sustainability? What do we really mean? And how do we, for instance, create sustainable public service internet? How do we even define that word and start to use it to our advantage vis-a-vis, as somebody noted, the sort of neoliberal use of sustainability, as in the UN Sustainable Development Goals and so on and so forth, that are now used as corporate benchmarks. Then there's been a lot of conversation about engagement, which was already addressed by Christian as well. In that regard, also the role of young people and how they are so very active already in social media, doing work towards their future, and we really don't see them in the public sphere that much. How can we use them? How can PSM use them? Then there's the issue of internationalization. We're talking about global problems, but the PSM, how national is, and is there a way to international and to an internationalist approach to public service? And then, of course, issues of power. How much is PSM part of these power structures? How can we create something that goes beyond this partisanship, this ultra-partisan conversations that we're having right now? How can deliberations be done? How can we create policies that truly support sustainability in a way that these power struggles are bypassed? So these are the themes, and we have very many specific questions. Michael, can I ask you to help me out here and choose one question of these themes that we can start with our conversations?
Perhaps
Do you want to pick one? Which one do you think is the most important?
I think the most important in the Q&A section would be about health communication. But if we look at the chat, one important question was about public service media and internationalization contra local media, contra national borders. Do you see a future where public service media can be on all these three levels, and how have they to work together?
I think that, yes, that is a problem. I didn't list the changing kind of geopolitics of all of this as being one of the challenges, but it undoubtedly is. We're seeing a movement towards the balkanization of the internet. We're seeing particularly authoritarian regimes using more and more blanking out, blocking, filtering in all kinds of ways. So the internet, the idea of the internet as an indivisible universal presence, I think is a fantasy. That isn't how it is at the moment. So we do need to engage with that politics. We're in a very reactionary period of politics, I think, in many countries. But that, again, it's very easy to be pessimistic about that. But look what's happening in the States. Okay, Biden is a moderate, but he's already making some very, I think, constructive interventions. He's talking a different discourse now. He's talking a discourse of inclusiveness. He's talking a discourse of citizenship. A dramatic change from the rhetoric of Trump. So I guess one of the things that us old lefties kind of feel is you have to just hang on in there and keep things in play, because history is going to turn. It's not going to be like this forever. And I can see some real signs of hope. And I say, I go back to the mobilization of young people. It's one of the reasons I'm so interested in climate change, because I think my student, that's the one issue that they can all connect to. Conventional politics is problematic, yes, but the climate change issues are something that they feel very strongly about, and are prepared to mobilize around. So we do have, it's not that we live in an apolitical world. I think we live in a different politics now. The old politics that I grew up with, and obviously you may remember from your childhood, I think that's beginning to decline. It's losing traction. It's certainly losing confidence, and it's losing the ability to imagine the world in a different way. It's stuck. But climate change raises questions about everything. It raises questions from the most intimate problems that you might have to a planetary purview. So it's the ideal basis on which to build a new kind of politics, and that politics is already coming. It's already coming. So I think that's why I wanted to put it into the argument about public service media. That if public service media doesn't engage with it, then it's going to miss, I think, one of the great opportunities of the coming years. That if public media, and not just public service media, but university, all public institutions, I think have an enormous opportunity to lead in demonstrating that it's possible to change practices in a way that is environmentally positive rather than environmentally negative. The coal industry is not going to do it. The oil industry is not going to do it. The concrete industry is not going to do it. Even Bill Gates isn't going to do it. So it's left to public institutions. And that, I think, if we can make a persuasive and practical case, I think that will be an enormous benefit in terms of mobilizing public support. People will be able to see the point of that immediately.
I think there's a direct link from what you just said, Professor Murdoch, to the most upvoted question in the Q&A box, our democratic choice of questions. An anonymous attendee asks, what do you think about the role of public service media in health communication and reporting on public health? I have anecdotally observed in Australia a support of expert and government-based action from PSM versus a prioritization of contrary opinion and economic and individualist framing by the Murdoch media, for example. So here we see this power struggle and discursive struggle already in terms of health communication.
Well, I would be in favor of going down the avenue that we went down with tobacco. I would ban all fast and processed food from the television screen. Not just in advertisements, but I would ban people in dramas eating it. The level of the health catastrophe that that is causing, particularly among children, is huge. It's a hidden health crisis. I mean, you can go to any, well, you can't at the moment because we're all locked down, but if you go out into the city, how many really fat children do you now see? You see a lot. And that didn't used to be the case. It's escalating. And the main culprit is those kinds of processed and fast foods. So yes, it's a health crisis, and it's going to ripple through their lives. It's going to make them more vulnerable to everything. Cancer, diabetes, everything. So we have a duty, as we had with cigarettes, to do something radical, to say we are not going to promote these as desirable anymore. We're going to make them invisible. I would say that that would be one of the best things we could possibly do.
Michael, what would you like to highlight next?
Okay, perhaps a question that goes in a different direction, but is a problem of public service media today. Question by Peter Thompson. Do you have any suggestions for addressing the issues of audience fragmentation, particularly among younger audiences who often have limited interest in public service media channels?
Well, it's a chicken and egg argument, isn't it? There's limited interaction because perhaps they're not being given what they need. I think public service media is. I think there's a tendency to run to catch up. So that there's this idea that we have to be like Netflix now. That's the future of television is Netflix. We have to be like Netflix. Well, if you're like Netflix, you're going to be wiped out anyway. Netflix has massively more resources than any public service media could possibly muster. So that's not the right terrain to fight on. But I come back to the things that public service does really well. And there's a lot of things it does really well. And they do actually get good responses from young people. Depends what you measure, doesn't it? If you measure ratings, then of course you're going to be in trouble. But if you measure whether people during the course of an average week find something that they really engage with, then I think you're on much stronger ground. And if you look at those figures, reach, as it's called, you'll find a very different pattern. So I think you choose the ground you fight on. Do not fight on the ground of the opposition. First rule. Define the ground and say, this is our ground, this is where we stand. And public service broadcasting is still doing magnificent things. If you've not seen them, I would recommend you to watch Small Acts, some of the best drama of the last 20 years. It's incredibly moving and incredibly skillful. But more than that, it opens up a genuine window on the experience of a community that have been so much caricatured and so much maligned. That in itself is an argument for public service media. I don't believe Netflix would have done that. I really don't. And certainly I don't believe Disney would do it, and I don't believe Amazon would do it. So that's what we need. We need those risky, edgy, but deeply engaged forms of drama and communication. We do not need more people in costumes pretending that they would like to be in Jane Austen.
Wonderful bridge to another question. Actually, Dr. Tongjin Smith notes that German PSM is trying to capture youth via specific programming called Funk. And relating to that, Chloe Hofcroft from the Public Media Alliance asks, please, can you come back to your first recommendation on sustainability as a core value? What initiatives have you already come across of public media leading the way in promoting environmental and social sustainability? So since you are an optimist, what are the sort of concrete markers you already see?
Well, I think we're just at the beginning of this argument. It's very easy to forget how recent the climate change crisis has become visible. I mean, now you see stories almost every day. 3-4 years ago, you didn't see that. On the contrary, you saw still denialists on television. And the BBC, to its great shame, would invite, because of the spurious idea of balance, whereas 99% of authoritative scientists would tell you we have a crisis, you would find one ex-cabinet minister who denied it. And this is balance. To their credit, the BBC realized that balance was a fiction. There are some things that cannot be balanced. We do know that the Earth is not flat. So inviting somebody on to argue that it is not very helpful. So we've made some progress. But I go back to this argument about the material basis of communication, because it's so often forgotten. It's not only what's on the screen, and it's not only the organization of production. It's about the energy that is consumed by broadcasters. It's about the materials that are consumed. It's about the equipment. I would like to see broadcasters taking a very proactive role in announcing and moving very quickly towards clean energy, to moving towards recycling, for example, not throwing old equipment away, not buying anything from a company that uses exploitative labor, and making that part of the principle to say we stand for these values. We stand for social justice. We stand for environmental integrity. And these are the practical things we're doing to try to make that a reality. That would be a very good first step, would it not?
Wonderful, thank you. Michael?
Okay, perhaps building on your answer now, we have two questions that ask, can public service media go beyond the content production? So on one hand, should be there more players than only the classical public service broadcasters? And on the other hand, should it be limited to content production? What about media literacy? What about responsibility of the audience? What about ethics of reception? Should that be the future of public value?
Well, that's a very good question. Again, I didn't have time to put this on the table, but it's almost been forgotten. But the BBC was in the vanguard of computer literacy. The BBC ran for a number of years a computer literacy program, was in association with Acorn Computers, very, very primitive computer at the time, but it was one of the first desktop computers. It was widely adopted in schools, and they were part of instituting a new curriculum in understanding computing. And they also were the first to introduce BASIC, which was one of the very first programming languages, and teaching children how to program. So they've been there, they've done that. Unfortunately, they haven't done it recently. And I think you're right. There's an enormous job to be done in educating people about the media they use, and getting them to be more proactive about understanding the ways that those media manipulate them. I think it's beginning to happen. People are becoming now, when you point out to people what happens to all the personal data that they give away, they're genuinely shocked. Most people still don't understand what Facebook does. And when they do, lots of people say, oh, I'm going to close down my Facebook account. We need to educate people about the social cost and the personal cost of these so-called free gifts, yes? And I think a computer literacy or digital literacy course prominently on public television that went through all of those things, but also helped people to understand how they could make things with digital media, not just putting filters on the photograph that they put on Instagram so that they, they look beautiful, but something creative, something wonderful. And it's possible. So yes, I agree, absolutely. I think let's call it digital literacy, yes? It should be about the way things, the backstory of the way things work, but also projecting it forward to say to people, look, these are tools. You can use them. And you can use them in all sorts of ways that maybe you haven't thought about before. Let me show you how to do that. That would be wonderful. So absolutely. Because Facebook's not going to do it. If you've ever tried a Facebook tutorial, you'll know. They don't want you to know how things work. Of course they don't.
Thank you very much. There were interesting research and examples just shared in the chat as well. I believe Patricia Aufderheide had done work on PSM, countering disinformation. We also got a link to the EBU's report on programming for young people that show also great examples. So we'll share all these links with you all together with the YouTube recording. Maybe to sort of round up the conversation, there has been a lot of concern in the chat as well as in the Q&As about the partisanship and that we're living in an era of extreme partisanship. And PSB, PSM in different contexts are often seen as representing certain kind of views. How do we overcome that? Because we are talking about problems that should bridge partisan lines and even national borders, as we mentioned before. How might PSM approach invite more, for instance, conservative or other groups into digital commons?
Well, yes, I think we need to build a coalition, and that's certainly at the moment in Britain, that's very difficult because we're living through a version of the so-called culture wars, where there's a very strong polarization, and it's to do with insecurity. So if you take, for example, the reckoning with Britain's legacy of slavery, yeah? This is a very important part of our history, but there's a huge movement to silence commentary on that, to say, oh, look, we don't want to look backwards, we want to look forwards, that. And anyway, the slaves probably enjoyed it. And you think, well, we can't do that. We have to, as a community, we have to understand where we've come from, and we have to accept responsibility for what we've done. But at the moment, that's very, very difficult in the current situation. You have historians who are being silenced. You have, academics who are being silenced from teaching what they want to teach. So yes, at the moment, it's a problem, but not everybody of a conservative hue shares that thought. There is, I think, somewhere in the middle, a much more broadly based respect for the idea of citizenship, for the idea that you're part of a moral community and that your own self-development depends upon the quality of public life, yes? So that the notion of the common good or the public interest is not exclusively owned by the left. Now we can argue about what you mean by the public interest and the common good, and we argue about it all the time. But behind those arguments is a notion of something bigger and self-interest. And if you read Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, most conservatives have never read Adam Smith, of course, but Adam Smith was very clear that the highest value was altruism. The highest value was generosity towards other people, not self-regard. And I think that is deeply buried in a lot of conservative philosophy, actually. So yes, you start there. You say, okay, do you want to absent yourself from society? Do you think that the idea of the public good is nonsense? People say, no, of course not. Okay, well, what does it mean then? And then you can begin a conversation rather than an argument. You can begin a conversation about what does it mean to live together? On what conditions will we do that? And I think we're beginning, we've had 30 odd years of neoliberalism, and it's been a destructive disaster for many people's lives, unless you happen to be a hedge fund manager, in which case it's been actually very good for you. But for most people, it's been a problem, and particularly for young people. Young people can't even begin to contemplate buying a flat or a house anymore. They can't begin to think of having a job that gives them satisfaction. We've stripped out opportunities that were there 30 years ago, and we've not replaced them, except by the thinnest possible promise of self-actualization through self-employment. No. Young people understand that very well. They understand that they have been screwed. They have been passed over. They have been nailed to the wall, and they have. And we have to accept responsibility for that. And we have to recreate a sense of responsibility to other people. That a civilized society is a society that does not have abject levels of poverty, does not have colossal closures of opportunity. And that argument you can find support for across the political spectrum. So again, I'm hopeful. We have to find a way of making that argument accessible and more generalized. And finally, that's why public service broadcasting matters, because it's about citizenship. It's about thinking of yourself in that way, not thinking of yourself as a consumer or an influencer, but somebody who belongs to a complex society that has to be navigated, and where you cannot have everything you want, and you have to be responsible for those least well able to look after themselves. That's the ethic at the heart of it. And that's why it matters, because so much else in the culture is ranged against it.
May I quote Giuliana Tiripelli, who just posted on chat? This is so inspiring. Professor Murdoch, thank you for your generosity. And to quote Dr. Winston Mano here, this is fascinating arguments in defense of PSM and PSB. Clearly, we are talking about a range of things. It's about curating content, audience input, sharing public principles and policies to meet today's challenge. And you just also laid out the way how we can do it across different ideological lines. I would like to now give the floor to any of our other inner PSM project members. Klaus, would you have a comment from the perspective of a public service broadcaster, especially you in terms of public value?
Well, I do have lots of, but I think we have already consumed a lot of time at the moment. So I would give space for all the ideas and perspectives to come. Yeah. So I'm definitely not preaching here. I think Graham already found the most passionate and stimulating and clever closing remarks. So I would leave it like that, because we need inspiration. We need these new ideas out there. And I would really be happy if some of those who are still listening to us might also contribute to our research project, which is basically just a cluster of ideas and perspectives. Because I think what Graham already told us, it's about the tipping moment, which divides risk from chance and the negative impact from the opportunities. Now, I think what we've learned is that there are a lot of opportunities connected to the world of public service media if it is able to change, if it is able to attract people, and if it is able to be successful and not just a niche market. So again, I would leave it to the intelligence of the many people, and hopefully we will find an opportunity coming together. I think this event shows that even though the pandemic leads to a lot of damage, we are still here. So actually, I would like to say, hopefully, goodbye and see you all. And maybe, Minna, you will find some last remarks or comments.
Similarly, thank you all for continuing to create this community and these conversations. As said, we will send you information about the Utopias project and an ongoing debate we are having about the future. As Christian just posted in the chat, we are actually creating a manifesto for the future of PSM led by Klaus and Christian. Also, we will send you the YouTube link as well as all the resources you shared in the chat. That was amazing. And there were many questions that left unanswered, something I think which we might create another webinar about, which is PSM outside of Europe. So let us think about that. I would call many of you to participate and maybe give us more ideas about that, because there were so many good questions about that. From my end, thank you everybody, and let's continue working together and debating and discussing.
Can I say one last thing? I'm very conscious that we have dominated the screen, and I know there are a lot of unanswered questions. So if anybody would like to continue the conversation, you're very, very welcome to email me. You can find my email on the Loughborough University website, and I'd be delighted to hear from you and share some more experiences. But thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, and bye-bye.
I'll see you later, I guess.
Yeah, Graham, thank you very much. That was somehow very inspiring. And again, hopefully meet you in person someday after COVID. Yeah.
Well, yes. Well, maybe there won't be anything after COVID. Who knows?
No.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so.
Okay.
Take care now.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.